friends, and welcome to the video. This is track number 67 about AI policy. Members of our CU community were joined by Dr. Justin Biddle from the School of Public Policy at Georgia Institute of Technology to talk all about AI, or artificial intelligence, policy. We discussed what the public sentiment was towards public policy and automation, as well as what kind of AI is transformative and we should be paying attention to. It was a great discussion, and we're so excited for you to watch. So thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Welcome to this episode of The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future of democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. Hi, my name is Elena. I'll be the host today. I'm calling in from Broward County, Florida. I'm an 11th grader, and I'm so excited to be joined here by some amazing community members and special guest, Justin Biddle. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about AI policy. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully you'll all be able to see. Or thank you, Gary, or I can.
Oh, you got it. You got it.
Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. So we're going to get started with word association. We're going to go in order. So when you see your name on the screen, just pipe up, introduce yourself, and then say 1 to 3 words you think of when you think of AI policy.
Hey, hi. My name is Justin Biddle. I am an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Also a member of the leadership team of the Ethics, Technology, and Human Interaction Center here at Georgia Tech. And I work around issues of AI ethics and policy. So I'm very happy to be here.
And what are 1 to 3 words you think of when you think of AI policy?
So the first word I think of is data. And I think of that because the primary techniques for producing artificial intelligence nowadays are data-driven. So machine learning techniques are techniques that use lots of data in order to train systems to become quote unquote intelligent. And so all of the issues that we have around data, whether that's privacy or control or bias or discrimination or anything like that, those issues become very relevant for AI and AI policy. The second word I think of is equity. And I include that because as with the case of any really complex technology, AI or AI policy doesn't benefit everyone or harm everyone. It rather affects different people, different groups in different ways. And so in thinking about what kind of policies to put in place around AI, we need to think not just about whether it benefits some people or harms some people, but the distribution of those benefits and harms. And we have to grapple with really kind of complex questions about, is it okay to harm this group as long as some other group benefits, right? So that's the second one. And the third is democracy. Because AI and AI policy, I think, should be under democratic control. When we're developing policies for AI, those should, to a significant extent, I think, be public policies that are debated democratically. Corporate control is not the same as democratic control. So that's my third word.
Hi everyone, my name is Jahi and I'm a junior in high school from Dayton, Ohio. And for my 3 words, I would say disruptive or reconstructive. I think that there's a lot of fear surrounding how it could radically change society, like socially and geopolitically, or it could like patch up all of our current issues and maybe lead into the age of freedom, which is pretty exciting.
Hey, I'm Madison, a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, and my 3 words would be regulating over stifling. My mind automatically goes to automation when I hear AI policy, and I think a lot of people's approach is that we should try to slow the evolution of, or I guess the eventual arrival of mass automation. But I think that in reality, what we should be doing is trying to best accommodate to it. And so that's why hearing AI policy is exciting to me.
Trying to put this in 3 words, but complementary with, like, I don't know, character, in the sense of character development. I think we can only, I think a big concern that people have is that we're going to be like manipulated by AI, or we are. And I think any policy discussion should eventually be paired with how do we develop strong minds and communities that are less easy to manipulate in the first place.
Hi, I'm Alina Cabra, a high school senior from Basel, Switzerland. My words would have to be justice for all, because when discussing AI policy, we need to remember that there are multiple groups that need to be included to make, yeah.
Can you say that again? My audio cut out on the end of it.
Just the 3 words or the entire thing?
Start with the 3 words, and if you want to explain it again, you can.
Justice for all.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, my name is Crystal, and I'm a high school senior from Texas. My 3 words are fear of machinery. I feel like a lot of people don't like to discuss AI just because it goes into a lot of different groups, especially the economy and racism. And so people just feel very uncomfortable with the discussion. So I'm glad that we're having this today.
Adam, you can go next. I'll wait to be last.
All right. So when I think of like AI policy, I think of like for like most of the majority of what I think like about it, like some people are like, oh, they're gonna take our jobs. So what I think of it is like 3 words. So like AI, but with limits. So like you can still have like artificial technology, I think. Like it helps our world, but I think that it should have limits. So yeah, because we don't want it to be too powerful.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase it in 3 words, but I think I'm going to say not centered, because I don't think that when we're talking about public policy in general, AI and machinery isn't really centered in those sort of discussions. I don't think, like, when people think of public policy, we don't immediately go to thinking about automation and machinery and AI and stuff like that. We tend to think about the larger social issues, but that does not mean at all that AI policy is not important or valuable or has meaningful impact on where our society goes and where our democracy goes. Okay. Awesome. So before we get into the provocation and question portion of the discussion, I want to remind everyone, please keep your talking points concise so that way everyone gets a turn to speak. And feel free to listen. Treks are just as much about listening as they are about sharing. So if anyone has a provocation or a question they'd like to pose to get us started, feel free.
I think I could begin with one. What would be like the general public sentiment towards AI? I think a lot of us aren't, we really haven't dedicated much thought and consideration to this. And so with the little knowledge that we do have, like how do we feel about this, that it's going to be part of our future?
can I ask a question about the questions? do we discuss this question, or may we add additional questions?
You can add on to it, you can discuss it, and we don't have to go in order at all, just when you feel ready to respond. Go right ahead.
I guess I wanted to just throw in the question of what AI is, or what we mean by AI, because it's in order to know. I like this question about what the general public sentiment is toward AI, but we have to have a handle on what we mean by AI also to answer that.
I think when I think of AI, I tend to think of, AI as an artificial intelligence, and like this sort of shift that we're seeing technology wise with automated stuff. And, like nowadays we have Siri on our phones that can literally look up anything in the world and give us any piece of information. When I think of AI, I think of like, kind of like robots and automation and the kind of technology that is now becoming so normal in our phones and watches and all that sort of stuff.
I think it's interesting to think about how AI, or what we think of as AI, shifts. Because if you think about something being artificially intelligent, let's say, so our calculators are artificially intelligent, right? They're machines that are intelligent. They can do certain things, they can calculate certain things much better than we can, right? But I don't think we think of them as AI anymore because they're so familiar. But Siri, you're certainly right. We would think of that as AI. So I think kind of the what we think of as AI shifts over time depending upon how familiar the technology is to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think,
Oh, sorry, you can go.
Okay. Well, to answer both questions, I would agree with Elena and like what she thinks of when she hears AI. But I would say for most people, if I were to guess, what comes to mind is probably robots or like machines. And in terms of like what the general public sentiment would be towards AI, it's probably just, quite frankly, scary because it's unknown and it can be potentially threatening. Like having a machine that would be competitive with human intelligence is definitely something that is scary to think about, not only in terms of automation but in so many other with so many other factors as well. So
My knowledge towards AI I gravitate towards like the AI that big tech uses for their algorithms for social media and such. And then I also think about like the basic AI that's used to classify images. And then like clinically, there's really cool AI like rapid AI that's able to more accurately make a diagnosis based on images on like aneurysms. And then there's also, I recently heard about generative pre-trained transformer 3 AI, like GPT-3, and that's like able to actually create like text from data that's like extracted from the internet. And so I see that there's some AI that can be really helpful, but others that can like outperform human cognition, and that's I think where the fear sets in.
Yeah. So I want to expand more on like Justin's point about like familiarity of technology. It doesn't necessarily have to be AI. A lot of us as humans, like we're scared when some new thing comes out. It's like the fear of unknown. So like an example of that would be like you getting used to like let's say you got like a new TV. You're probably going to spend like a lot of time on it like during the first week, then a year later. So with like AI, I think that we've adjusted throughout human history when we're like, oh, something's stealing our jobs, something's expanding. I think that we could be able to adjust to AI. I think that there should be some limits though, to not let it, overwhelm human intelligence, that it takes over too much. But I think that we should have it still be controllable by humans to most extent. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think again with like automation, I think that the automation is not like obviously inherently bad. Like the jobs that are quote unquote being taken by AI are low level jobs mostly that most humans don't enjoy actually like get fulfillment from doing, like fast food jobs and things like that. So I think that we could have a better future with automation. It's just a question of like, well, then what do people like fill their time with, right? Like, where do they get that sense of purpose and meaning from? And I think the Andrew Yang in me is coming out right now, but it's like we're undervaluing a lot of work right now. For instance, an example that he gives is stay-at-home moms, like are valued right now at 0 by the market, but with automation, more people will be able to fulfill that role. And yes, technically, maybe someday a robot would be able to take care of a kid, but that's not really a job that is going to ever be truly replaceable by AI or any sort of machinery.
Um, whenever whenever I think of AI, it's like the way I think of it, I do think of it like almost a blanket term, which is not great, but not gonna lie, my my knowledge of it is limited. So I think of it as machinery, algorithms, and just robots. But on what Madison said, the fear of losing jobs, I do strongly agree with that because the thing about it, machinery and AI is kind of just taking over the physical labor jobs, which of course, like you said, people don't really like doing that. But some people are only available to do that because they don't really have the education to specialize into something else, and that kind of also just goes into people not really being able to afford to go and get an education. And I think that's one of the things that people are really scared about because they don't have the tools and abilities to specialize into something else. And so people are really afraid of that.
yeah, I'd like to expand on like that point. So like I think what would be good is to like I guess like if AI does like take some of those physical labor jobs that people need, I think that what we could do is replace them with new jobs. Like a lot of things like when like they're like, oh, we're gonna lose jobs, we're gonna lose profit, it usually actually creates more jobs. So with like AI, it could create like new jobs building robots, which is kind of like physical labor. And then also with like, let's say another example is climate change. People are like, oh no, we're gonna lose profit if we start going carbon neutral. Oh no, we're gonna lose jobs. But actually, you'd create new jobs, and you'd probably be more profitable in the long term. So thinking of it at an economic perspective.
And around this, around the question of, you know, the implications for work and jobs, and also just more generally about public sentiment, I mean, it's important to recognize, I think, that AI doesn't develop on its own. We develop it, human beings develop it for specific purposes and specific tasks. And, you know, we have some control over that. So there are some debates right now about like, I think someone mentioned the example of like robots that are used for childcare or robots that are used in say nursing contexts. And we could make the choice to try to develop these in such a way that they take over those tasks, or we could develop them differently so that they are primarily geared toward assisting others so that human beings can do those jobs better, right? And that's something that's up to us. It's not like the AI develops on its own to either do one of the two, right?
This is sort of a provocation. We talked about like what the general public sentiment is toward AI, and we kind of talked about like why there is this general public sentiment towards AI. But I would just like to think like, what do you think the sentiment is like in legislation and like creating laws and policy around AI? Do you think that that is something that Congress and like our legislative bodies, wherever you may be around the world, is that something that they want to prioritize or like move on, or is that something that might be put on the back burner for a while? I would just love to hear people's thoughts about, you know, AI in terms of legislation and policy.
I think particularly in the US, it's becoming a topic that is well known. And although I do think there is still a lot of work to be done, particularly on policies pertaining to things like facial recognition softwares, as they're usually very faulty towards certain ethnic groups. And although I think for example, places like San Francisco have banned the use of this technology, however, have not banned the use of the software being used. So although I do think there are steps being taken, I do think that there is still a lot of work to be done, particularly in making what is currently being done just, fair, and equal for all. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, and my answer to this would be is that no, it's not thought about enough in policy. I think the main issue is that politicians are expected to prepare us for the future while accommodating to people's needs right now. And one of the best examples of that is automation. Again, I think about UBI and how I just think that would be something great for in terms of automation, because eventually we get to a point where not everyone can have a job, and so what are we going to do? How are people going to provide for themselves? And so if you think in terms of a solution like that, well, many of those current solutions would harm people right now in other industries, and it wouldn't accommodate their current needs. And so it's just really hard to prepare for the future with a lot of this legislation because it harms what people need right now.
Yeah, so I wanted to expand on that, like why politicians like aren't acting too much on AI policy. I mean, I think that we should think about like other crises that have happened in the past, like recently. So like politicians wait till like the threat becomes really bad, that it's like it's gonna be really bad for their elections, or really bad for them personally, to like take action. Like examples of that would be climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic. They wait until it really becomes bad for them until they start taking action. And then also like with, but yeah, so yeah, I think yeah, that's all I was gonna say.
I think that there's kind of like this inherent division with most of AI development being like a privatized enterprise. And then also it's like insulated in certain areas geographically. Like we instantly think about Silicon Valley. And so it's kind of like we're almost existing on different planes. The government is over here doing their own thing. And then there's people out in Cali who are like inventing our future in real time almost. And I think that we should close that gap, as well as inviting everyone else, to just the general public, to come to the table and open up this conversation.
Yeah. I also wanted to add like more on my previous statement about like why, and I think like what would be interesting in like the future when they do start taking like policy and legislation is if they make this issue political. Like we have like a history of making like issues like this political. There's the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change was made political. Who says that AI can't become political? One part of the situation would be Republican one side, and then the other side might be Democrat. So that's what I'm scared of.
I think we're seeing that already a little bit when you look at, say, technologies like Twitter and Facebook that have, say, speech recognition and software that tries to look for deceptive content or disinformation, and it might kick you off one of those platforms, as happened to Donald Trump, if if they deem it to be so, or if they deem that to be important. And you saw very different reactions to, say, Twitter and Facebook by Democrats and Republicans when that happened. But I was going to make a couple of other points about the question of AI and policy and legislation. And one is just to, I guess, wonder about how much knowledge, say, members of Congress actually have about these issues. I think maybe one of the reasons why there's not a whole lot of legislation around these issues is because a number of politicians might just not really understand what's going on in terms of the technology and things like that. But there are also, I think, different levels of engagement depending upon the technology. So, someone mentioned facial recognition earlier. There have been debates, and Congress has actually discussed issues around AI and robots, especially like sex robots or companionship robots and things like that. So that's an area of AI that Congress would be I think interested in engaging in, because it's very controversial and things like that. Whereas other areas of AI, say AI that's used in driverless cars or something like that, they might kind of respond very differently to that. So I think it's very, it can be specific to the area of AI that we're talking about.
So, like within these different genres of AI, since you are pretty well versed in this, what would you say is something that we should devote more attention to because it has like more transformative power than the other?
I'm not. I'll have to think about the question about transformative power. One kind of area of AI that I look into and that I worry about a little bit is AI that's used in policing and in the criminal justice system. So, I mean, the facial recognition has been mentioned a couple of times, and that is a case where you have an AI system that works differently for different groups of people. Facial recognition is more accurate when it comes to white faces than darker skinned faces. And so using that in, say, a policing context can have disparate impact on different communities. But there are other types of AI that are used in these contexts. For example, there are predictive AI algorithms that attempt to predict, say, the likelihood of someone recommitting a crime. And so if someone commits a crime and they are going to be sentenced to a prison sentence, in many states, you have AI algorithms that will make a prediction about the likelihood of them recommitting a crime, and how long their sentence is will depend in part on that algorithmic output. And there you get into all kinds of racial justice issues and things like that. So I think AI in those contexts really should be scrutinized quite a bit.
Yeah, just to add on for like predictive policing, so there's like predictive policing systems where they tell police officers like what areas they should be policing in, but the data is based on like previous incidents from even like decades and decades ago. And so it's based on when police were making racially driven decisions. And so that goes on to inform what they do even today. And so inequality is ingrained in these AI systems when they're supposed to be the most objective.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And so that gets back just to the issue of data. Like these systems are trained on data. And if the data itself is problematic, then the outputs of the system are going to be problematic. They're going to reflect the biases that are in the data itself.
I think that I could offer a provocation towards that, and that would be, how can we? So we have this idea that since it's a machine, it's going to be neutral and unbiased. But since we're training it on human selected data, it has biases ingrained in it. So how can we prevent that from happening? And also, I've also heard of like AI developers trying to train AI to align with certain human values, and they've created like models that are called like reinforcement learning from human feedback, where once like the AI makes a prediction, there's like a human judge that says, "Oh, this is good. Oh, this is bad," and it incorporates that feedback into its system. And so, how do we find those values, and how do we find the right data?
I don't know. I think it's probably, if it's based on human data, it's probably impossible to remove all human bias from it. And I think we just have to get to a point where we ask ourselves, um, like, yes, we acknowledge that this AI system, I get predictive policing is a good example. We acknowledge that the systems are not going to be perfect, but are they going to be better than the human alternative, right? Like, is a system that is slightly biased um, going to be less biased and more objective than, say, the average police officer? And so, in terms of like training, I'm not sure, but that's just a question that I would ask and try and operate under when knowing when to use AI.
So I think that this could really fall into like the policy sector. It's not just like determining what we think about AI, but like how we utilize it, like and how much power we lend to the AI.
I think I agree with the comment about the data will be at least biased to some extent, right? But there are, I think, a couple of things that we can do to improve the situation. One is just to recognize the importance of the biases in the data, so that we take a lot of time to scrutinize and to curate the data to make sure that it's really good data that we want to be using to train these systems. Some say research groups put a lot more thought into that than others, right? And I think, really kind of thoughtful machine learning groups will recognize it's most of the work goes into curating the data and not creating the algorithms. So there's a lot of work that needs to be put into data curation, and also just making sure that the data is representative. So again, to the point about facial recognition, it's a real problem if you're only training the system on white faces and not black and brown faces, right? And so that you have to make sure that the data is representative with regard to the kind of groups that it will be applied to. But one other issue I just wanted to raise here was that we also, in addition to asking questions about data, we also have to really, I think, make sure that we're asking the right questions about these systems in the first place. So do we want, is it the best idea to be creating systems that predict criminality? Or should we create different types of AI systems that do different things, right? So if we want to reduce bias in the criminal justice system, we could say, again, try to develop systems that predict the likelihood of a criminal to reoffend. We could also develop systems that analyze, say, judges for biases in their decisions, right? So the question of which systems do we want to create? Are we asking the right questions? Are we applying these systems to the right problems, right? That's a question that we kind of ask before we get to those questions about data and data curation and things like that. Just, are we asking the right questions in the first place?
Yeah. So I guess like on the right questions, I think that we should what kind of questions should we ask is kind of like my question for everyone. Because yeah, I'm just wondering because some questions are good, some questions are bad. So what would y'all consider are good questions that might help society more?
I think that's a great question. And I think that all of this is reminding me just about in general how we need to, as a society, ask a lot more questions about a lot of things. If you were at the greenwashing trek last week, we talked a lot about how asking questions, as consumers, could help us inform better choices and help see changes. And I think that that's exactly what applies to AI. But as for specific questions, I think that we need to center equality and equity in those. So will the data that we're using provide equity or create equity, and will it treat people equally? Like you were saying earlier, Justin, with representative data, we need to make sure that we have all groups represented, because if we don't do that, we're going to have biased data, and biased data equals biased results. So I think that whatever questions we ask should be centered around the idea that we need to make AI as fair as possible and as unbiased as possible, and as equal as possible.
Yeah, I think a big question is ultimately, what role do we want AI to play in our lives? Justin brought up a great point that we control what becomes AI. We can choose to automate certain things and what to not automate. And so we should really just know what our vision for our future is and what role AI is going to play on that, because you know the arrival of more AI is inevitable. So it's silly to say that we don't want it to play a role. And so yeah, just asking how it is going to affect our lives.
My question I think that we should ask is like, how can we use AI to help us instead of like using AI to bring us down or kind of show like a lot of the wrongs of like humanity itself, like with biases and like a lot of the bad data. So, but yeah, so like how can we use AI to help us versus how what like it could show human flaws. So yeah.
I think that in an ideal world, we would like dedicate it to altruistic causes, and hopefully like depersonalized ones like clinical, like medical things, or like predicting whether this is dangerous or not. But there's also like that looming thought in the back of your mind about like international competition and the possibility that it could be weaponized. And so I think there's so many factors to consider.
Yeah, going off that point, I like some destructive ways, I guess, like we've used AI or are going to use it. Like they've made up like this new military strategy recently, with like AI. So like using like destructive ways, so like war, and like especially with like a lot of extremism rising around the world, like a lot of even some authoritarian governments could use AI for bad things. Surveillance, like in 1984, like really just they could also use it to expand the government's power and like take away rights in some cases. We just got to use it in like helpful ways, I think, in my opinion, not harmful. That's the harmful way.
I think that's a great stopping point. We're going to move on to our reflection and application portion. So basically in this portion, it doesn't have to be 1 to 3 words, but just give us a basic reflection on what we talked about and how you plan to apply the conversation that we just had moving forward. So this does not have to be in order. Whenever you feel ready to share, go right ahead.
I think the coolest thing I learned was when Dr. Riddle mentioned that we could use AI to question biases in judges. So it seems like some of the AIs that we've created were directed towards answering questions that were inherently biased themselves. So using AI to evaluate bias, on the other hand, it's kind of like a backwards way of thinking, which is so cool. And I think expanding possibilities like that is very promising.
But yeah, for me, I would like say like for like AI, like how like with like the biases and that's thing, like using it in like good ways like that. We could use it to maybe prevent war. We could use it to help communities. We could use it to identify biases in the police system. We could use it in like really like helpful ways fighting against climate change. So yeah, I think like just using it with like positive opportunities. AI was like we could use it as like a fresh start for humanity to start doing more good in the world.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I was gonna say, I think that's a really good point. I think that the next step in this is, because we know that that we have the ability to use these tools in beneficial ways, in beneficial, equal, and just ways. I think the next thing is to, or at least what I took away from this track, is that the next step needs to be to persuade others that we can do the same thing. And I think particularly if we persuade enough people, we can end up persuading legislators to enact change, to create just and equal policies that that aim to ask questions about or I guess what aims to ask questions about our future, and through that possibly asking questions about now and about the state we're in now regarding to AI.
Yeah, I think my reflection is similar to some other people's as well, but this conversation really shifted my mental model about what AI looks like in the future. I really see AI now as an assistant to humanity instead of a replacement. And so instead of like, AI replacing the role of a parent, as Justin mentioned, like being an assistant, making nursing roles easier. Justin also mentioned in terms of like the criminal justice system, um, using these tools, but not completely treating them as objective truths and still kind of like scrutinizing the quality and working with AI instead of like replacing our work with it. And so that's a really cool mental model to have going forward. And so thank you all for that.
I think my general reflection is a bit different. I love like policy and public policy, and I spend a lot of time like reading on public policy and stuff like that. But I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about AI policy in particular. And I think that this track has just made me think a lot more about the opportunities that it presents. And also it's made me think about, I wonder why, we don't see AI being talked about as much. We mentioned that it might be because there are like a lot of pressing issues and AI just might not be the top of the list. It might also be because there's such a fear around AI and automation because humans don't want to be replaced. But I think that, like Madison was saying, AI should be used as an assistant versus a replacement. And I think that with that mental model, there are so many opportunities for creating policy that is going to be, beneficial to the future of society and especially democracy.
My main, I think, reflection at this point concerns the question above about what questions we should ask about AI. Just how do we know what the right questions are and who gets to decide what the right questions are? What kinds of, say, participation should we be trying to include in really kind of formulating the questions that will drive AI into the future?
I think this track has helped me realize that we talked a lot about the benefits and drawbacks, but I think one of the things I didn't realize is that humans like humans, there are some areas where just AI and machinery in general isn't going to be able to replace the people in those fields. So it's made me feel more confident and just excited for the future and seeing how AI can benefit us.
Thought this was a great conversation. One reflection was I had was kind of related to Adam's question above, which was how can we use AI to help us? And I think we need to dive more into how we want to be helped. And what does a better life look like? What does our personal flourishing look like, and what does our community's flourishing look like? So this has just motivated me more to just think about how CU can do more to kind of to people get young people to recognize what topics and questions are relevant to their lives. And to everyone's point, how do we I think in order for us to change who's at the table talking about public policy, they have to know that they should be at the table, right? So you have to like educate people that the topic should matter to them, right? But that itself is a privilege to even to know that it's important.
All right, I think that just about wraps up the trek. Thank you all so much for coming today. I had a lovely, lovely time. What did all of you, especially you, Dr. Biddle, think about the trek today?
I had a great time. I thought this was a wonderful conversation. Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I was very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and thanks to Jae-hee for the great idea to invite.
Yes, Jae-hee, that was an incredible idea.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Like what I loved about like this trek and the last trek I went to is that like a lot of these treks they always like go with like two neglected like topics. So like AI policy. The last one I was on was like the environment. Like people really ignore that, like humans and nature and stuff. So I always like put these in like a bookmark to come back to them later because sometimes I just want to, you know, get a reminder of like what I learned from the treks. So,
Well, if you would like, if anyone would like to see, as you might have seen, I was taking notes the whole time. The notes I put in the chat of this Zoom meeting, as well as this recording, will be posted on YouTube and social media for everyone to see and reflect on later. So don't worry. You don't have to worry about not remembering because I promise there are plenty of opportunities for you to look back on this conversation. But thank you all so much for coming. I hope you have a lovely Sunday, or if I think we're all in the States, so Sunday. And I hope to see you all very soon in another trek.
All right,
Thank
see
you.
you.
Bye everyone.